The Monroe Doctrine derived its legitimacy from a rage for liberty that was older than the American Republic itself. While Congress alone held the power to declare war, James Monroe would define the conditions of a just peace. He would raise the standard of non-intervention in such a way and with such conviction that no future president would dare to pull it down. And indeed, back to John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, not the least of the arguments employed by the president against the Soviet Union was the Monroe Doctrine. More than a few observers detected feelings of relief as he came to the end of his second term. He would be 67 years old when he walked out of the White House for the final time, a very old man indeed by the standards of the 19th century. Perhaps his weariness reflected a compound of pride, disillusionment, and horror at the ravages of political ambition. For much of his life, Monroe had aspired to the presidency. Like most who have attained that goal, he went out of office both sadder and wiser, and, it must also be said, poorer. The three presidents from Virginia had many things in common. One thing they all wished probably they didn't have in common: they all died impoverished. Thomas Jefferson almost lost Monticello for a number of reasons, including his own extravagance. In the end, the state of Virginia held a lottery to try to save the place. And it was sold not long after his death, but he died basically penniless. James Madison intended to free his slaves, and in the end he was unable to do so because he too died in poverty for another reason. Dolly, he had a stepson. Dolly had been married before she married James, and he was a wastrel and a drunkard, and he basically went through the Madison estate, and in the end Madison was unable to carry out his wishes in terms of freeing his slaves. The saddest case of all, though, I think, is Monroe. Monroe, to the end of his life, was petitioning Congress to pay his diplomatic expenses going all the way back to his turn as George Washington's special envoy to Paris during the French Revolution. He was forced to sell his estate in Virginia and to move to New York City, to move in with his daughter, and that's where he died. And one other thing that Virginia presidents have in common: he died on the 4th of July, 1831. Jefferson died on the 4th of July, 1826, and Madison could have died on the 4th of July, 1836. His doctors offered to keep him alive until that date, and it tells you something about Madison, that he didn't care for the symbolism. So he died a week in advance of the glorious 4th. Monroe died so poor that he couldn't even be buried in Virginia, in his native Commonwealth. So he was buried in New York for 25 years until the eve of the Civil War. A plan was hatched to bury all the Virginia presidents together in the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. Well, Mount Vernon turned him down, but and Jefferson stayed at Monticello. But a great state funeral was arranged through the streets of New York and then in Virginia. So James Monroe returned to his beloved Virginia. And so much for three from Virginia. Questions? Comments? Anything surprise you about any of them?
You call them all strict constructionists?
Yeah.
So what was their relationship with the Supreme Court?
Good question. They were strict constructionists, but they also, and that was illustrated dramatically the way Madison conducted the war. But even Madison, for example, the Supreme Court, well, we'll go back. You remember the famous debate between Hamilton and Jefferson about a bank, about creating a national bank. That's one of the defining moments in the early republic. And indeed, political parties came out of this debate. And Hamilton, in the end, was convinced Washington that a bank was necessary, that the Constitution allowed it, and indeed the courts, including the Supreme Court, agreed. Jefferson let the bank die. Madison, who is Jefferson's disciple, allows a second national bank to be chartered. And it too was upheld by the courts. And it's simply a tacit admission that perfect theory runs up against harsh reality, that the United States is no longer simply an agrarian, rural republic, that it's becoming a world power, a commercial power, and that government is in fact growing, and that it needs a bank. Jefferson made war on the Supreme Court. In fact, the great irony, when he talked about we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, that lasted about a week because, it sounded great, but he was very upset. You may remember Adams, in his last hours as president, signed a whole host of commissions. He appointed a whole host of judges. John Marshall, the great Chief Justice, was one of the midnight appointments, or almost that late in the Adams administration. Jefferson wanted to undo them. He was frustrated in his efforts to undo them. So he undertook something that has never happened since, because it was such a disaster. He encouraged his followers in Congress to impeach a member of the Supreme Court, who was, today, he would not be on the Supreme Court. He was openly partisan, and many believed him to be insane. That, however, was not enough to get him kicked off the court. And Jefferson, ironically, had overplayed his hand. And then, of course, you had John Marshall, who was this great Federalist. Long after the Federalist Party died, the Federalist notions of a strong central government lived on in John Marshall and his court. And the famous Madison v. Marbury case, in which basically President Madison was almost an innocent bystander. But in any event, it's complicated. But what the Chief Justice did two contradictory things. He said, yes, these appointments, these late appointments, were illegal, and they couldn't take their appointment. But no, the president didn't have the authority to enforce that. Only the court did. And what Marshall did in that one decision was basically to elevate the Supreme Court to a level that, frankly, none of the founders had envisioned, a level that was consistent with the other branches of government, a level where basically the court decided what was the law. And so the great irony is that Jefferson and John Marshall were cousins. They both lived in Virginia, and they detested each other, hated the ground they walked on. And so you had this great duel, and John Marshall won. And so Madison, Monroe, and all of his successors, in effect, had to defer to this court that had no authority. They had no troops. They had no police power to enforce their rulings. But it says something about the American people and the Constitution, that when the court ruled as it did, presidents and the rest of us went along. Yeah.
What is meaningful about Madison's presidency other than the War of 1812? And what about the election of 1816?
Well, first of all, we'll back up because at this point, there was a sense of the Virginia dynasty and a very hierarchical approach to the presidency. And Madison and Monroe, who were good friends and neighbors, had a falling out in 1808. Madison was Secretary of State. he assumed he was Jefferson's choice, he would be the next president.